So, what sounds should a native Russian speaker focus on to reduce their accent when they're trying to achieve an American accent? And before
Mhm.
we get started, actually, I know because you have a lot of experience with Russians, I
Mhm.
feel like they do, like other Slavic languages are pretty similar. Would you put other, like for example, like Ukrainian speakers, would you give them the same advice because they do have similar sounds or?
Yes, they are pretty similar. So I've mostly worked with Russian speakers more than people from Poland or the Ukraine and those countries. I have had clients from those countries, but definitely more Russian speakers. I would say in general, they are pretty similar. Um, I think that one of the biggest struggles is in the intonation. Again, intonation is so, so, so big. Most people only want to talk about pronunciation, but half the time, the bigger challenge is actually just the pitch. Russian speakers are extremely flat in their intonation most of the time. So there's no up and down, it's just everything is equal. And so they can sound bored when they don't want to sound bored, or they can sound unenthusiastic even if they're enthusiastic. Um, I have a client from Russia that I'm working on pitch with, and her pitch kind of stays low. So we've worked a lot on getting her to go up in pitch. And that has made a very big difference for her, just kind of creating more up and down in her voice and being able to experiment with the musicality. So I think that's the biggest thing that Russian speakers should focus on if they were to take one thing. For consonants, V versus W can be a challenge. They kind of mix them up, don't articulate them fully. So with the V, you need to vibrate your upper teeth against the inside of your lower lip, like this. Your upper lip needs to barely move because we don't really use it in this sound. It's only the upper teeth to the inside of the bottom lip. But also, it's not which some people do as well, trying to create the vibration, right?
Where's
And
the
then there's the
W?
W.
Oh yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. And then there's the
Oh, no, no,
W.
no. That's okay. Yeah. So then there's the W, which does involve lip movement. But even there, we don't want to do this. What? Where were you? Like this. So that's the other thing. You have to be able to kind of bring your lips together. Where were you? Without protruding them forward too much. So that's usually something they have to work on.
Mhm. I like that. So the W and the V,
Mm-hmm.
and I'd imagine the R as well.
Oh, yes. Yes, absolutely. I typically don't like to start with the R because, again, the thing that stands out the most is the intonation. So, what I would say is it is important for Russian speakers to work on the R, but I think it's better for them to get very, very, very incredibly good at intonation and rhythm and then worry about the R later because it's not as distracting as kind of taking the musicality out of the language. American English is so, so musical. It's up and down all the time.
Hmm. And you didn't explicitly say it, but when we are working on an accent, like changing or like improving your accent, we'd focus on what kind of stands most in the way of sounding like a native speaker. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely.
Like kind of what could be like the most distracting or like what would make the biggest change like that.
Mm.
What else? I know I had other questions. Oh yeah. I find this tricky with the R. How would you explain to someone who can't pronounce the R correctly? So maybe they like are like Spanish or Italian and they make the R sounds. How would you
Mm-hmm.
explain like yeah, I'm just curious what kind of instructions you'd give to these people.
Yeah. So at the beginning, I struggled a lot with how to teach the R because I didn't like the explanation I heard from most people because it didn't work with anybody. And it was just that the tongue needs to kind of bunch up into itself. It needs to curve like this, kind of moving back, like this. A lot of people talk about the lip movement, but again, I can do without it. I
Mm,
don't need to move my lips. So it's clearly more in the tongue. Yeah, I would say it's more complicated than the tongue simply bunching up, which most people can't do. So I really like the way. Have you heard of Eric Singer, the dialect coach from Hollywood? Oh, I love the way he teaches. If you search accent coach on YouTube, he might come up as number one, possibly. He's incredible. Um, but yeah, it's really impressive. He has a lot of videos where he kind of analyzes the way actors do an American accent or how American accents do British accents. It's really cool. But yeah, so I like the way that he explained the R articulation, which he says it's a molar R. So, in other words, the sides of the tongue need to kind of go up and get very close to your upper molars. And that's essentially how you kind of hook the sides. You need to kind of tether the sides of the tongue to your molars in the back. And that makes it a lot easier to understand where you're going with it.
And I like that explanation a lot more because even when I've taken other courses on pronunciation, some of the explanations that I hear are like, if I was told that, I don't know if I know what to do. But,
Right.
since I am an English speaker, it's like, okay, that makes sense, I guess.
Mhm.
But I like
Yeah.
the molar R. That's a good one.
Yeah, because it gives you a clearer goal that's easier to physically achieve. Now, most people can't immediately do it. It's not like, oh, I told you it's a molar R, now you're going to do it perfectly. If I could tell you how long it took me to learn the Spanish R, and I knew the technically correct explanation for how to articulate it, but it took me about 2 years.
Mm.
So, learning an R sound in any language, if it's not the same R as the one in your native language, you shouldn't have high expectations for learning it immediately. You should expect it to take a while and understand that you might have to keep working on that continuously and then also start working on something else in the meantime.
Ooh, I like that advice. That's good. Ooh, are there anything else you'd like to add, or is there anything else you'd like to add for Russian speakers and focusing on reducing their accent?
Yeah, so I would say working on the vowels is very important for Russian speakers as well. I think speakers of almost any language that's not English need to work on the vowels quite a bit. Um, I'm not a fan of saying there are maybe 5 sound replacements we need to make in the vowels. I always like to teach all of the vowels from scratch because it has to do with mouth posture, which we'll get into later.
Mm-hmm. I like that. And then similar question, but different. If you were speaking to an English teacher that was like, oh, what are some tips? Like, what can I do or say to help Russian speakers improve their accent in English? What would you tell
Mm. It depends so much on the Russian speaker. I've had some Russian clients that tend to open their mouths too much on some vowels, and then other Russian clients that don't open their mouths almost at all. So I think that you would have to ideally have that person do an accent assessment where you can kind of take an inventory of the things that you notice. And I find that most of them struggle to open the mouth more than opening it too much. If that's the case, then you need to do jaw exercises with them. They need to be able to comfortably open their mouths and not in a tight way that's kind of reluctant to stay open and wants to close immediately, but they need to learn how to do it in kind of a relaxed way that feels natural. So I would say if you teach them that, it seems simple and it seems unrelated, but if they can really get good at that, a ton of our vowels become much easier to articulate.